They came at sunset, clipboards in hand, fake badges shining under the last light of day, 5 men in tactical gear, stomping across my gravel driveway. Like they owned it. Their leader smiled, but her eyes never did. She raised her hand, and the others spread out, rifles ready, like they were about to invade. But here's the thing. They had no idea what waited for them inside my ranch. And when the truth came out, everything changed. Welcome to HOA Secrets, where the quiet streets of suburbia hide the darkest stories. My name is Daniel. I live on a ranch just outside the city. I came here for peace, wide fields, and a simple life. But the Homeowners Association followed me like a shadow. They tried to control my land, my home, even my freedom, and that's when the real battle began. I came to this ranch for silence, for mornings where the only sound was the wind moving through the trees, for nights where the stars stretched forever. No traffic lights, no barking dogs from next door, no petty complaints taped to my door. But peace never lasts when the HOA has your name on their list. At first, it was small things. A letter about my fence being too tall, another one about the color of my barn door, then a fine for my American flag. Because apparently their freedom looks intimidating when it waves too high, I thought it was a joke. How could anyone drive miles out here, to the edge of nothing, and still pretend to rule the land like a suburban sheriff? But they did. And every week, another envelope arrived. Another warning. The president of the HOA. Her name was Mrs. Caldwell. She had that smile, the kind that stretched across her face, but never touched her eyes. She showed up at my gate one morning, clipboard in her hand, like she was signing off on prisoners instead of neighbors. She looked at me like I was already guilty. "You're in violation," she said. No hello, no good morning, just those words, like a judge delivering a sentence. I stared at her, and for a moment I almost laughed, because behind her, 4 men stood in fake uniforms. They wore tactical vests, patches they bought online, and sunglasses that made them feel powerful. They weren't police, they weren't soldiers, they were just HOA enforcers. Volunteers with too much time and too much ego. They spread out across my gravel driveway, boots crunching as they tried to look intimidating. One of them even rested his hand on the butt of his rifle, like he was waiting for me to run. I didn't run. I didn't even move, because I knew something they didn't. They thought they were walking into a simple game of fines and threats, but what they didn't know was who I used to be, and who was standing inside my ranch that night. See, I don't talk about my past much. People in this neighborhood think I'm just another man who bought land to escape the city. But before this, before the fences and the hayfields, I trained men for real battle. I worked with Navy SEALs, men who knew silence better than sound, who could move like shadows and strike like thunder. And last week, some of them came to visit me. Old friends, brothers I'd sweated with, bled with, survived with. So when Mrs. Caldwell raised her clipboard like a weapon, when her enforcers spread out like a firing squad, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Because the truth is, they had no idea what kind of storm they were walking into. I leaned against the fence, calm, quiet, watching them try to play soldiers. One of them barked orders at me. "Open the gate. This property is in violation." Violation. That word again. Like land. Like freedom. Like peace could ever belong to a committee. I didn't answer. I just looked at them. And that silence. I saw their bravado crack. Just a little. Mrs. Caldwell stepped forward, her shoes sinking in the gravel. She pointed at the barn, the flag, the porch light I'd strung across the fence. "All of this is against regulation," she said. "You can either fix it or face the consequences." The consequences? I almost asked her if she even knew what consequences looked like outside her HOA handbook. But I kept my mouth shut, because sometimes silence is louder than any word. Behind the barn doors, my friends waited, 5 real warriors, calm as stone, ready for anything. They weren't dressed in tactical costumes. They weren't holding props. They were the real thing. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just about rules, or fences, or flags. This was about power, about people who never had real control, grabbing at the smallest scraps they could find, and they picked the wrong man to test it on. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the gravel, and I could feel the air shift. It was the kind of silence right before something breaks, the kind that makes your heart beat slower, waiting, listening, wondering what will happen next. I met Mrs. Caldwell's eyes, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt behind her smile. Maybe it was the way I stood too calm. Maybe it was the way her enforcers shifted uneasily, realizing they weren't the toughest men on this land. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something she couldn't name, but could feel. She tapped her clipboard against her side. Her voice cracked for the first time. "We'll be back," she said. Then she turned on her heel, and the others followed, like shadows retreating from the night. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning, because when petty power meets real strength, when fake enforcers try to play war on a real soldier's land, something always breaks. The night after they walked away, I sat on the porch in the dark, listening to the wind move through the fields, but the silence felt different. It wasn't peace anymore. It was a warning. Because people like Mrs. Caldwell, they don't retreat, they regroup, and sure enough, by the next morning, the letters started again. They weren't left in my mailbox anymore. They were nailed to my fence, pinned under rocks on my porch, slipped under the barn door like poison sliding under a crack, each one written in the same cold words. Violation notice. Final warning. Failure to comply will result in legal action. I burned the first few in my fire pit. I crumpled the rest and fed them to the goats. But the thing about pettiness is, it never burns away. It only grows. The neighbors started watching me differently. Some waved less. Some looked away when I passed by in town. Whispers carried faster than wind. They said I was hostile, uncooperative, dangerous. And all of that came from the HOA's mouth. Funny how quick a neighborhood can turn on a man. Just because one woman holds a clipboard, but I didn't bend. I didn't paint my fence. I didn't lower my flag. I didn't change a thing. And that's when the real games began. One morning, I woke to find spray paint across my barn door. Rule breaker. The letters were crooked, desperate, written in a hand that shook with anger. Another time, I found nails scattered across my driveway, sharp enough to tear through the tires of my truck. Who did it? No one admitted it, but I knew. Petty people fight with petty weapons. Then came the notes, not official notices, but scraps of paper, slipped under my door at night, scrawled messages. Move out before it's too late. You don't belong here. You can't fight us all. I kept them in a shoebox under my bed, not because they scared me, but because they told me everything I needed to know. The HOA wasn't just after my money, they were after my will. They wanted me broken, quiet, obedient, but they didn't know the man they were dealing with. Every night, after I locked the barn and shut the porch light, my friends and I sat around the table, 5 Navy SEALs, hardened men who laughed at fear. We shared stories, planned out drills, and every so often, glanced at the dark fields outside the window, because we knew sooner or later, the HOA would push again, and when they did, they wouldn't be ready for what they found. One evening, I caught Mrs. Caldwell parked down the road, headlights off, her silhouette sharp against the glow of her dashboard. She thought she was hidden. She wasn't. She sat there for almost an hour, watching my land, scribbling in her notebook like she was planning a war. I leaned on my fence and watched her back. And in that quiet standoff, I realized this was no longer about property lines or barn colors. This was about dominance, about one person's obsession with control and another man's refusal to bow. The neighborhood thought it was simple, a disagreement over rules. But what they didn't see was how deep it had already gone. Because when people taste power, even a little power, they don't let go. They choke on it. And they keep choking until someone makes them spit it out. The air around me grew heavier every day. My ranch wasn't just my home anymore. It was a battlefield, a stage where pride and fear danced together, waiting for the final act. And I started to wonder, how far would they go to break me? Would they stop at letters and nails, or would they take their little game into something bigger, something more dangerous? The morning felt wrong from the moment I opened my eyes. The sun was bright, too bright, and the air outside felt thick, like it was waiting for something ugly to happen. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee steaming in my hand, and I saw the crowd. Cars lined the road in front of my ranch, neighbors standing on the gravel with folded arms, whispering in clusters, eyes locked on my land like vultures circling a carcass. And there she was, Mrs. Caldwell, standing tall in front of them all, clipboard clutched against her chest like a holy book, her smile stretched wide, but her eyes, those eyes were colder than winter steel. This wasn't a visit, it was a show. She raised her voice loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Attention, everyone. We are here to address repeated violations of the HOA bylaws." Her words cut through the morning air, sharp, deliberate, rehearsed. I took a slow sip of my coffee and leaned against the porch railing. She wanted an audience. Fine. Let her have one. She gestured toward my barn. "The structure is out of compliance. Color, height, and unauthorized use of property." She pointed at my flagpole. "Unauthorized display. Unapproved modifications to community standards." She even waved her pen toward my goats. "Livestock kept in residential property without prior approval." The crowd murmured, some shook their heads, others smirked, but all eyes kept swinging between her and me. I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against me. They didn't see me as a man anymore. They saw me as a rebel, a villain against their perfect little rules. Mrs. Caldwell's voice grew louder, more dramatic. She spoke as if she was delivering a sermon. "As president of this HOA, I must ensure fairness, compliance, and safety for all residents." Then her smile flickered, sharp as glass. "And when one homeowner believes himself above the rules, he threatens the entire harmony of our neighborhood." That line hit like a hammer. The crowd muttered louder now, shifting feet, casting looks at me like I was a disease spreading across the street. I stayed silent, because silence, when timed right, is more powerful than any speech. But then one of her enforcers stepped forward. He wore the same fake uniform, a tactical vest too big for his body, sunglasses hiding his nervous eyes. He held up a laminated notice like it was a weapon. "This is the final violation warning," he barked. "If you fail to comply, the HOA will pursue legal seizure of this property." The words echoed in my head, not because they scared me, but because they were ridiculous. Seizure of property by an HOA, dressed up like toy soldiers. The crowd whispered in shock. Some looked at me with pity, others with satisfaction. And that's when I laughed. Not a loud laugh, just a quiet one, slipping through my teeth like smoke. It caught them off guard. Mrs. Caldwell's smile froze. The enforcer's hand trembled against his notice. The neighbors blinked. Confused by my calm, I stepped down from the porch. Slow, deliberate, each step crunching the gravel under my boots. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I just walked until I stood in front of Mrs. Caldwell and her little army of clipboard warriors. "You say I'm a danger to this community," I said softly, almost gently. "But the only danger I see is a group of people pretending they have power they never earned." Her eyes narrowed, her smile straining at the edges. "This is not a joke," she hissed. "You are in violation." I cut her off, still calm, still steady. "Do you even know what real violation looks like?" The crowd fell silent. The air thickened, heavy, expectant. Behind me, the barn doors creaked open, and one by one, 5 men stepped out. Not neighbors, not enforcers, not toys in tactical vests, but real soldiers. Navy SEALs I had trained with, men carved from discipline and silence. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was louder than thunder. The enforcers froze. Their cheap uniforms sagged under invisible weight. One of them lowered his laminated notice, his hand shaking. Mrs. Caldwell's smile cracked for the first time. Her eyes darted between me and the men standing behind me. And for the first time, I saw something in her face she had never shown before. Fear. I took another step forward, close enough for her to hear the low calm in my voice. "You think rules make you powerful," I said, "but power isn't paper, and it isn't fines, and it isn't uniforms bought online." I leaned closer, my eyes never leaving hers. "Power is knowing when to stop before it's too late." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The crowd had gone silent. The whispers died. Every eye stared at me, then at the soldiers, then back again. I straightened, stepped back, and let the silence stretch. Finally, Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat. "This meeting is adjourned," she muttered, and just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away. The enforcers followed, their boots stumbling in the gravel. The neighbors broke apart, scattering back to their cars in awkward silence. I stood there, coffee still warm in my hand, watching them retreat, and I knew this wasn't victory. Not yet, because people like her don't surrender. They wait, they plot, they come back stronger. But that morning, the neighborhood saw the truth. They saw who held real strength on this land, and that truth couldn't be erased by any fine, any letter, or any clipboard. The soldiers went back inside the barn, quiet as shadows. I stayed on the porch, watching the dust rise from the road where the cars disappeared. The dust from their cars had barely settled when the first letter came. This one wasn't handwritten. It wasn't nailed to my fence or slipped under the barn door. It came in a thick white envelope, official letterhead printed across the top, a law firm's name stamped in bold. As if bold ink could scare me, I tore it open at the kitchen table. The words were cold, legal language that twisted into threats. Cease and desist. Failure to comply will result in SOAS, civil penalties. Possible seizure of property under Community Enforcement Clause. I almost laughed again. Civil penalties, property seizure. All because I wouldn't paint my barn beige or take down a flag that meant more to me than any rulebook ever could. But I didn't laugh long, because I knew this wasn't just Mrs. Caldwell anymore. She had brought in lawyers, people who could twist words into weapons sharper than knives. This wasn't a neighborhood spat, it was war. The next week, I started seeing strangers in suits walking the street, clipboards in their hands, cameras around their necks. They stopped in front of my property, snapped photos of my barn, my truck, even my mailbox. They scribbled notes, shook their heads, and moved on to whisper with Mrs. Caldwell at the end of the road. The neighbors watched from their porches. Some nodded in agreement, others pretended not to see, but all of them stayed quiet. Too quiet. Silence can be louder than shouting, and in that silence, I could feel the tide turning against me at night. My phone rang, blocked numbers, heavy breathing on the other end, sometimes a low whisper before the line cut dead. "You can't win. You'll lose everything. Move out before it's too late." I didn't tell my friends right away. The SEALs who stayed with me didn't need to be dragged into suburban madness. But they noticed anyway. They saw the way I double-checked the locks at night, the way I lingered at the window, watching the road, the way my jaw tightened every time the phone rang. One of them finally said it out loud. "You know this isn't about fences anymore," he muttered. "They want to break you." And he was right. It wasn't about property lines or barn paint. It was about control, about bending me until I snapped, or until I left. The irony burned deep. They wanted me gone, because I didn't fit in. But isn't that the point of freedom? To live the way you choose, not the way someone else writes it down on paper? Still, the pressure kept building. I started noticing small things around the ranch. My trash cans knocked over in the night, dead animals left near my fence, scratches across my truck door that hadn't been there before. Every petty act was a message. Every silence was a threat. The shoebox under my bed grew heavier with notes and scraps. I kept them all, like evidence for a trial that would never come, but each one whispered the same message. "We're watching you." Then came the summons, delivered by a man in a cheap suit, handed to me on the porch while the neighbors peeked from behind their curtains. It called me to an HOA board hearing, a formal review of my non-compliance, legal words, dressed up as justice, but really just another theater show. The day of the hearing. The room smelled like dust and old carpet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting shadows across a long wooden table. Mrs. Caldwell sat at the head, flanked by her loyal board members, their clipboards stacked high, pens clicking like tiny hammers, and in front of them, a microphone, waiting for me to confess my sins. I didn't sit right away. I let the silence stretch. Their eyes shifted, uncomfortable, waiting for me to break it. Then I leaned forward, my voice calm, steady. "You think you can scare me with papers and pens," I said. "But you don't understand something. I've faced worse than this. Much worse." One of the board members coughed nervously. Another shifted in his chair. But Mrs. Caldwell didn't move. Her smile was carved in stone. She read off my violations one by one. Fence too tall, barn unapproved, flag unauthorized, livestock prohibited. Each line like a nail driven into the wood of the table. Then she leaned closer. "And failure to comply," she said softly, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "will result in foreclosure." The room fell silent. Even her board members looked uneasy at that word, foreclosure, the nuclear option of an HOA war. I met her eyes, and for the first time, I spoke without pausing, without breaking my tone. "You can send lawyers. You can send letters. You can send your little army of clipboard soldiers." I leaned closer to the microphone. "But this ranch isn't just land. It's who I am, and I will never bow to you." Her smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. The hearing ended without a decision. They said they'd review the matter further, which in HOA language meant, we didn't expect him to stand so strong. But I knew it wasn't over. It was only beginning to crack open into something darker, because when people like her fail to break you with papers and pens, they find new weapons, sharper ones, dirtier ones. That night, as I sat on the porch staring out into the fields, I thought about power, how it poisons people, how a simple position on a board can turn a neighbor into a tyrant, and how far someone like Mrs. Caldwell would go, just to prove she couldn't be defied. The crickets chirped, the stars burned cold, and somewhere in the dark, I swore I saw headlights flicker and vanish again. They weren't done with me, not by a long shot. The night after the hearing, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with the shotgun across my lap, watching the tree line, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The crickets sang their endless song. The wind moved through the fields, but underneath it all, I felt something crawling closer. By morning, the first sign appeared. My water line had been cut. Not by accident. The clean slice of a blade told me everything I needed to know. Someone had come onto my land while I slept. Someone bold enough to trespass. Quiet enough to leave without a trace. I fixed it before the sun was high. But the message wasn't about water. It was about control, about showing me that nowhere, not even my own land, was safe. The next night, it was my fence, wooden post snapped clean in half, wire pulled loose and scatter. And across the dirt, the goats had wandered halfway to the road by the time I found them. I herded them back, rebuilt what I could. But the anger burned deeper than any broken wood, because fences can be mended, but trust, once cut, never grows back. The neighbors didn't say a word. They watched me from their porches as I hammered new posts into the ground. Some shook their heads, others smirked, and a few turned away when my eyes met theirs. Silence, always silence. And in that silence, I knew some of them approved of what was happening. The third night, it wasn't property they touched, it was me. I woke to the sound of glass shattering. A rock had been thrown through my window. Shards glittered across the floor. The rock wrapped in paper. I unrolled it slowly. 3 words scrawled in angry ink. "Get out now." I stood there barefoot, glass crunching under my heel. And for the first time, the weight of it all pressed hard against me. This wasn't just a feud anymore. It wasn't petty fines or legal games. This was war fought in the shadows. One strike at a time. I told my friends in the morning. The SEALs didn't laugh. They didn't smirk. They looked at me with the kind of quiet that soldiers carry when they know things are about to turn dark. "We can stay," one of them said. "Run drills. Watch the property. Turn this into a fortress." But that wasn't the point, because a fortress means you've already lost the freedom to walk freely on your own land, and I wasn't ready to live as a prisoner on my ranch, so I chose a different path. I decided to turn their pettiness back on them. Revenge, by compliance. Every letter they sent, every notice, every ridiculous rule they listed, I followed exactly word for word, to the letter. If they wanted the barn door painted beige, I painted it beige. 3 times over, until the smell of paint bled into the grass. If there's cottages, I said the grass around the mailbox had to be 3 inches. I cut it with a ruler in hand, measuring each blade until it was exact. If they demanded the porch light be approved wattage, I replaced it with the weakest bulb on the market, a sad little globe barely bright enough to see by. And then, I went further. I sent letters back to them, not angry ones, not threats, just questions, polite, endless, infuriating questions. What is the approved shade of beige for barns? May I have a list of all flag sizes permissible under current bylaws? Could you provide exact measurements for livestock enclosures that are technically not livestock? Every question forced them to reply. Every reply forced them to read their own ridiculous rules. Every letter turned their own system against them. Weeks passed, and the board meetings grew longer. Neighbors complained about wasted time, wasted money, wasted energy. The same rules they loved so much were choking them now, and I didn't have to lift a finger. I just followed orders. But pettiness, when cornered, doesn't die. It lashes out one evening, just as the sun bled into the horizon. Smoke rose from the edge of my field. Flames crackled through the dry grass, small at first, but hungry. Spreading fast, I ran with buckets of water. The seals grabbed shovels and blankets. Together we fought until the fire choked itself out. When it was over, I stood in the ash, my lungs burning, my hands blackened with soot, and there, half buried in the dirt, I found the matchbox. It wasn't weathered or old. It was fresh, used that night, arson on my land, because rules and fines and threats hadn't worked, because compliance had turned against them, because control, once slipping, turns desperate. I called the sheriff. He came, nodded, took photos, but his eyes told me what his mouth didn't. Without proof, without witnesses, nothing would stick. Another mystery lost in the wind. But I knew, we all knew. This wasn't mystery, this was wow. From that day on, I stopped playing games. The porch lights stayed on through the night, motion cameras went up on the fence posts, and the seals. They started running drills in the open, not to scare anyone, but to remind the neighborhood what real discipline looked like. The whispers grew louder. Some neighbors called me paranoid, others called me dangerous, but the same people who whispered also pulled their curtains tight when they walked past my land. Fear has a way of silencing mouths. Mrs. Caldwell didn't show her face for weeks. Her car didn't linger on the road. Her clipboard didn't tap against my gate, but her absence was louder than her presence, because people like her never disappear. They wait. They plan. They sharpen their claws in the dark, and I couldn't shake the thought, how far would she go next? If cutting water lines, breaking fences, throwing rocks, and lighting fires hadn't broken me, what was left? The sky that night was darker than usual. The stars hid behind clouds. The air hung heavy, and in that heavy silence, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. The night after the fire, I couldn't sit still. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every flicker of light outside made my hand twitch toward the shotgun leaning by the door. The seals stayed calm. But their calm wasn't peace. It was readiness. Readiness for something we all knew was coming. Because fire is not an accident, it's a warning. And the kind of people who set warnings in flames, they don't stop at smoke. The next morning, the neighborhood looked at me differently. Not curious, not judgmental, afraid. Mothers hurried their kids inside when I walked past. Men who used to wave now kept their heads low, and through every half-closed curtain, I saw the same thing, eyes watching me like I was the danger, not the victim, not the man fighting for his home, but the enemy. It's funny how fast people turn, how quick they forget who started the war, and who only fought back. By noon, another letter arrived. This one thicker, heavier, stamped again with that law firm's name. I ripped it open with dirty hands. Ash still under my nails from the fire, and there it was, the line they'd been circling around since the start. Notice of intent to foreclose. The words hit like a cold hammer, not because I believed them, but because I knew the board would go to any length to make it real, even if it meant twisting the system until it broke. I read it twice, then shoved it into the shoebox with the rest of their poison. But this one felt heavier than all the others. Heavier, because it wasn't just petty fines anymore. It was the threat of erasing me completely. That night, we set up shifts. 2 men awake at all times, one watching the tree line, one patrolling the barn. We weren't just defending a ranch anymore, we were holding a line. The first few nights were quiet, too quiet, and quiet is worse than noise because noise is honest, quiet. Hides on the fourth night. The dogs barked, low at first, then sharp and desperate. I grabbed my rifle and rushed out onto the porch. The motion lights flared across the field, and there, crouched by the fence line, were shadows. 3 figures, dressed dark, faces hidden, hands working fast with cutters on the wire. I shouted, my voice cutting through the night. They froze. The SEALs poured out behind me, rifles raised. Discipline sharp in every movement. The figures bolted, running through the tall grass, stumbling in their panic, leaving the cutters behind. We didn't chase. We didn't need to. We had seen enough. I picked up the cutters from the dirt, held them up under the harsh white light, heavy, sharp, cold in my hand. Evidence, proof they weren't just playing anymore. They were trying to tear their way in. The sheriff came in the morning. He nodded, wrote it down, bagged the cutters, but his eyes told me again what his words didn't. No witnesses, no names, no arrests. Another mystery, filed away to nowhere, but I knew, and so did the SEALs. This wasn't vandalism anymore. This was an invasion. The next day, the board called another meeting, not in their usual dusty hall, but right there in the neighborhood park. Tables lined with papers, speakers set up on poles, and neighbors gathered like it was some kind of festival. Mrs. Caldwell stood in the center, her smile wide, her voice booming through the microphone. She spoke of community safety, of dangerous elements, of neighbors who refused to cooperate. And every word pointed like a dagger at me. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who she meant. Everyone turned their eyes toward me where I stood at the edge of the crowd. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just let her speak. Her words dripped with poison. She painted me as violent, as unstable, as someone who threatened the harmony of their perfect little world. And the crowd. They swallowed it. Nods spread like disease. Whispers slithered through the air. And for the first time, I realized what she was really building. Not a case, not a legal battle, but an army. Because control isn't about rules, it's about numbers. And if she could turn the neighborhood against me, then she didn't need the law. She would have fear on her side when the meeting ended. I walked back to my ranch slow, deliberate, feeling eyes burn into my back with every step. I didn't speak. I didn't shout. But inside, the fire burned hotter than the one they lit in my field. That night, we planned, not attack, not violence, but exposure, because the only way to fight lies is with truth. We gathered every letter, every note, every rock, every scrap of their threats. The shoebox bulged with evidence, and we laid it out across the kitchen table like a map of war. Then, one of two. SEALs suggested something. Go public, he said. Show them the truth before she buries you under her lies. And for the first time, I considered it. Not a courtroom, not a board meeting, but the one place lies fear the most, the open light of the world. So we set cameras. We filmed the letters, the broken fences, the burned fields, the notes scribbled with threats in shaky ink. We told the story, every ugly piece of it. And as I stared into the lens, I realized something. This wasn't just my story. It wasn't just one ranch, one fight, one stubborn man against a petty tyrant. It was every neighborhood, every street where power turns toxic, where rules choke freedom, where silence hides cruelty. I uploaded the video at midnight. By dawn, it had spread farther than our little community could ever reach. Comments poured in, stories from strangers who had fought their own HOAs, outrage from people who had never lived under one, but could feel the injustice burning through their screens. And suddenly, the silence in my neighborhood cracked. Some neighbors stopped looking away. Some even knocked on my door. Quiet voices, hesitant, but brave enough to say, "We've seen it too. We didn't know it was this bad. We're with you now." Mrs. Caldwell didn't smile at the next board meeting. Her eyes were sharp, her words sharper. But the room didn't echo like before. Her power was slipping, her army was shrinking, and for the first time, I saw her cornered. But a cornered enemy is the most dangerous kind, because when lies start to collapse, desperation grows teeth, and I had to wonder, what would she do now that the world was watching? Would she back down? Or would she strike harder than ever before? The video had spread faster than I ever imagined. Neighbors who once hid behind their curtains now whispered in the grocery store. People who had never spoken to me stopped me in parking lots. Quiet voices asking if it was all true, and online. The story grew legs of its own. Thousands of strangers chimed in, some with outrage, sabotage, with warnings, some with their own stories of HOA madness. For the first time, Mrs. Caldwell wasn't the only one writing the story. The world was writing it too. But cornered enemies don't fade quietly. They come back sharper, and she was no different. The first strike came fast. A notice slipped into my mailbox stamped in red ink. HOA emergency meeting. Mandatory attendance. Mandatory. That word made me smile, because power is never more fragile than when it needs to scream. I showed up at the hall anyway, not because it was mandatory, but because I wanted to see her eyes when she realized her grip was slipping. The hall was packed, every chair filled, neighbors pressed against the walls, the air thick with whispers. At the front table sat the board, papers stacked high, microphones crackling with feedback. And in the center, Mrs. Caldwell. Her smile was back, painted on like a mask, but her hands, they shook when she held her notes. She opened the meeting with her usual sermon. Community standards, safety, respect for rules. But her voice didn't carry like before. Too many eyes watched her with doubt now. Too many whispers cut through her words. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Daniels," she said, my name dripping from her lips like poison. "You have caused chaos in this community. You have threatened harmony. You have endangered lives." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, letting her words fill the room. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend, because sometimes silence shouts louder than protest. She slammed her hand against the table. "We move to vote on foreclosure of this property, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her army of enforcers stood at the back, arms folded, trying to look menacing in their knockoff uniforms. But the neighbors, they weren't so quiet anymore. One voice cut through the noise. "Show the evidence." It came from a man in the back. Then another voice. "Where's the proof?" Then another and another, until the whispers became a chant. "Proof, proof, proof." Mrs. Caldwell's smile cracked. Her eyes darted across the room. She tried to raise her voice over the crowd, but the sound was swallowed by demand. "Proof, proof, proof." So I stood, slow, deliberate, every eye turning toward me as I walked to the front. I laid the shoebox on the table with a heavy thud, opened it, and spread the contents across the wood. Letters, notes, photos of vandalism, the rock wrapped in threats, the cutters left at my fence, the scorched ground where the fire had burned. The room fell silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. "This is the truth," I said, my voice steady. "This is what your president calls harmony." Gasps cut the air. Some neighbors covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Caldwell reached for the papers, desperate. But one of the board members stopped her hand. Even her own allies weren't so sure anymore. And then, from the back of the room, one of my neighbors stood. A woman who had never spoken to me before. She cleared her throat and said, "I saw them, the night of the fire. I saw Caldwell's car parked down the road." The room erupted. Voices rose. Accusations flew like arrows. Mrs. Caldwell shouted for order, her smile gone. Her mask shattered. She pounded her fist on the table. "This is slander, lies. You can't prove anything." But the proof was already laid bare, and the people who once feared her now feared the truth she could no longer hide. The board called for a recess. But the damage was done. Her power had cracked, her army had dissolved, and the neighbors who once turned their backs now turned their eyes on her. When I left that hall, the night air felt lighter than it had in months. The stars seemed brighter, the silence no longer heavy with threats. But I knew better, because power doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers in the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike again. The next morning, her house was empty, the blinds drawn, the car gone. Word spread fast. She had resigned from the board, moved out within the night. No forwarding address, no goodbye, just silence where her voice once poisoned every corner of this street. The neighborhood changed after that. Not overnight, not completely, but slowly. The weight lifted. The board meetings grew shorter, the fines fewer, the whispers less sharp. Some neighbors even apologized, quietly, awkwardly. as if the words burned their tongues. I didn't hold grudges, because grudges rot the soul, but I never forgot. I kept the shoebox, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how quickly peace can turn to war, of how easily a smile can hide a knife, and sometimes, when the wind is still and the night is too quiet. I wonder where she went, if she found another neighborhood, another clipboard, another army of rules to hide behind, or if she finally learned what real power looks like when it refuses to bend. But here, on this ranch, the air feels different now. The grass grows without permission. The goats wander without complaint. The flag flies high, untouchable, unapproved, free. And sometimes, I catch the neighbors looking at it with something new in their eyes. Not judgment, not fear, but respect, because they know what it costs to keep it there. They know what it means, and deep down, they know it could have been any of them. That's the truth about power. It never stays small. It never stays petty. It grows until someone breaks it, and if no one stands up, it swallows everything whole. I learned that the hard way, and maybe, so did they. So let me ask you this. If your HOA president turned your peaceful home into a battlefield, if she sent enforcers, lawyers, even fire to your doorstep, would you fight until she was gone? Or would you pack up and leave before the war ever began?